A nation's values are an interesting thing, and in recent years, it's become a bit of a contentious topic where many citizens feel like the values they grew up with don't seem to hold much weight anymore. I made a video previously on post-nationalism, a concept Canada's former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau proudly embraced, calling Canada the world's first post-national state, one where identity isn't tied to culture or history anymore, but to vague ideas that shift with the political winds. So it's not exactly shocking that Canada's brand new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, would say something that fits right in with that mindset.
But all of us come together, all of us must come together around the values of Eid. The values of community, of generosity, and yes, of sacrifice. These are Muslim values. These are Canadian values.
Prime Minister Carney, I have to disagree. And I say this as someone who not only grew up Muslim, but was raised in a rather authoritarian Islamic nation. A major part of leaving the religion at great personal, social, and legal cost was exactly what you're now calling Muslim values. These so-called values weren't rooted in community or generosity. They were grounded in total and unquestioning obedience, in rules you're not allowed to challenge. And if you did, the consequences were severe. In my world, they meant that women had to cover their hair so men wouldn't get tempted, that a girl and a boy sitting too close could be punished, that a woman's testimony was worth half a man's. They meant that if you stopped believing like I did, you could be disowned, jailed, or worse, killed. Apostasy isn't up for discussion in Islam. It's a death sentence, one still enforced across much of the Muslim world, both socially and legally. They meant that Jews and Christians, if tolerated at all, were treated as second-class citizens. They meant that laws weren't made by the people or debated in Parliament. They came from Scripture. These are the values that you're speaking about, without the whitewashing, without imposing modern moral language or political correctness onto it. Plain and simple. So when you, the Prime Minister of a liberal democracy, say Muslim values are Canadian values, I can't help but think that this is just dishonesty. Conversely, when Easter came around, the message was tame, respectful, sure, but nothing about Christian values being the foundation of Canadian society. The problem here is people like Carney don't actually understand what they're praising. Take Eid. It's not a feel-good festival about generosity and love. It's about a man preparing to sacrifice his own son because God told him to. And to commemorate that, animals are publicly slaughtered in conditions that would be illegal in any Western abattoir. That's not some fringe practice. That is the core ritual. I witnessed this as a child, but none of that gets mentioned. Instead, leaders like Carney talk about compassion and community, as if they're describing a bake sale. This is a deliberate form of whitewashing, what Edward Said once described in reverse. If Orientalism painted the East as exotic and backward, today's liberal institutions have swung so far in the other direction that they erase the illiberal elements of non-Western cultures entirely in a kind of benevolent revisionism. Today, the fear of offending religious sensibilities has eroded the West's commitment to free speech. Political leaders avoid any honest critique of Islam, not because they understand it, but because they're terrified of being labelled intolerant.
Will he, in the interests of public safety, follow the lead of France, Denmark, Belgium and others and ban the burqa?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Can I welcome her to her place? But I'm not going to follow her down that line.
And yet, if you look at how Islam functions as a political and legal system in Muslim-majority countries, often spoken about, especially from those who actually lived it like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, it is impossible to separate belief from governance or values from law. In Iran, apostasy is punishable by death. In Pakistan, blasphemy laws are used to target minorities and silence dissent. In Saudi Arabia, women only recently gained the legal right to drive, and even now live under male guardianship. These are not fringe interpretations. They are backed by scholars, upheld by courts, and practiced by millions. What's happening in the West is a kind of selective blindness, a belief that Islam, when stripped of its legal code and historical context, could be molded into something compatible with modern liberal values. But that's not how belief systems work. While Western liberalism prizes individual autonomy, Islamic societies often prioritize loyalty, authority, and sanctity. These are significant differences. They shape how justice is understood, how laws are made, and how people live. The problem is, when leaders like Carney reduce Islam to vague platitudes about community or generosity, they are effectively silencing voices, especially those of us who left the religion and know the cost of doing so. This is moral relativism disguised as compassion, and I would say to people like him to go out and talk to ex-Muslims in your countries. I can assure you, there are many of us. Quick note, making videos like this, the kind the mainstream avoids and that platforms don't exactly promote, isn't always easy. So if you found this valuable, consider subscribing, liking the video, and supporting the channel on Patreon. It's what helps keep this work independent without ever softening the message. Now, let's look at what's happening within Canada's own borders. According to the Canadian Department of Justice, at least a dozen honour-based killings have taken place in Canada over the past decade. And in almost every case, they're linked to a set of values that see women as property and disobedience as something to be punished. Are these Canadian values? What leads people to commit such crimes are tied to an ideology that justifies violence in the name of morality. And yet, this is what gets quietly brushed aside when leaders like Carney speak about Islam as if it's just a faith of charity and hospitality. Meanwhile, extremist Islamist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir still operate freely in Canada. This is an organisation that's been banned in countries like the UK and Germany, and for good reason. They openly call for a global Islamic caliphate and the replacement of democratic systems with Shariah law. They're not hiding it. It's in their speeches, their events, and their literature. And yet, they're still holding conferences in Canadian cities. Let me ask again, are Canadian values the same as values of such organisations? Unfortunately, a large part of the problem is that institutions across the West no longer know how to assert their own values. And historically speaking, this never ends well. Sociologist Paul Sheffer once described multiculturalism as a beautiful lie, a well-meaning idea that different value systems can coexist peacefully without ever clashing, when in reality, some values are fundamentally incompatible. You can't uphold gender equality and simultaneously protect a belief that sees women as inferior. You can't promote freedom of conscience while defending a religion that punishes people for leaving it. Douglas Murray, in his rather brilliant book, The Strange Death of Europe, also added to this by putting it bluntly. The West is suffering from a crisis of confidence, a fear of asserting its own moral framework in case doing so is seen as colonial or bigoted. But a society that won't defend its values is a society waiting to be reshaped, not by reason, but by whoever is loudest, most assertive, or most protected from criticism. Even within Canada, this fear is visible. Laws and policies are increasingly shaped around what cannot be said rather than what must be defended. Hate speech legislation, campus speech codes, and cultural sensitivity mandates have created an atmosphere where ideas are no longer debated, they're ring-fenced. Take the example of Bill C-63, the so-called Online Harms Act, a law that expands the government's ability to police speech under vague terms like detestation and vilification, with penalties that include fines and even jail time. Jordan Peterson called it a step toward a totalitarian hellhole, while Margaret Atwood, hardly a conservative figure, described it as Orwellian. When both a popular psychologist and a literary liberal are sounding the alarm, you know something's off. When speech that offends is criminalized and the state decides what qualifies, you essentially silence the truth. And in that silence, ideologies like political Islam thrive. We're already seeing that in many Western countries where Islamist blocs are organizing politically. Look, I didn't leave Islam at great personal cost just to stay silent while politicians in the West pretend it's something it's not. We have to be honest about what this faith actually teaches and what happens when it's given political cover. When leaders start repeating talking points that sound good on paper but ignore how these ideas play out in the real world, people like me start to wonder if they've learned anything at all. We owe it to ourselves and to the values we claim to believe in to speak honestly, not out of hate, but out of clarity, out of lived experience, and out of the simple belief that truth should still matter. Hey, you made it to the end. As always, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and give the video a thumbs up. It really helps. A massive thank you to all my channel members and Patreon supporters. You're the reason I can keep making content like this. If you want to be part of that and help me keep speaking freely on topics most people won't touch, consider joining the crew. Just hit the join button below or head over to Patreon. Even a small pledge goes a long way, and I would genuinely love to have you on board. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.